Good morning, everyone. I'm Andre Perry, Senior Fellow and Director for the Center for Community Uplift at the Brookings Institution, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our in-person event. Is everything we think we know about gun violence wrong? How a focus on place, collective efficacy, and community vitality offer new solutions. You know, I'm reminded every day as we walk through the doors of the Brookings Institution that gun ownership and gun violence have become ubiquitous features of the American experiment. Residents and visitors walk past or through metal detectors. News flashes of mass shootings and political and neighborhood violence appear on our television screens daily. We certainly read and analyze the statistics around gun violence, searching for a way out of this fatally cyclical trap in which we find ourselves. While most of us have come to accept gun ownership and violence as fixtures of American life, I must point out that we should not accept that violence is a natural outgrowth of ownership. I direct a center with community uplift in its very name, and we must recognize that safety isn't necessarily dependent upon gun ownership. This is why today's program is so important. We get to hear from experts who are pursuing evidence-based practices that can potentially lift us up from this fatalistic trap. Today, we'll be joined by Chicago behavioral economist Jens Ludwig discussing his new book, Unforgiving Places, there's always a colon, right? The unexpected origins of American gun violence. This will be followed by a panel moderated by Brookings scholar Hanna Love, featuring Karen Freeman-Wilson, president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, former mayor of Gary, Indiana, and Prema Katari Gupta, president and CEO of Philadelphia Center City District. This event is on the record and open to the media. Please feel free to submit questions on social media at Brookings Metro. The event will be recorded and the video will be posted on the Brookings website immediately following the program. Now I'm going to introduce Jens, who will give us a brief discussion of his book. Jens Ludwig is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, and co-director of the Education Lab. He has a lot of titles, and he was he's one of us here. He was a former visiting fellow here at the Brookings Institution. I'm not going to go on, but you certainly can find his writings on the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all the ABC alphabet soup of networks. So please help me welcome Jens Ludwig to the stage.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. What I wanted to do is just start off with a little overview. Let me see. Start off with a little overview of the problem that we're here to worry about. Let's see. And to remind us that the problem that brought us here is unique to the United States among rich countries of the world. So this is a graph that shows you murder rates per 100,000 people for rich countries around the world. You can see that I made this graph up myself because it's done incompetently. That's the United States bar. That's supposed to be labeled at the far left. And our murder rate is just absolutely off the charts compared to every other rich country. Even rich countries that we don't think of as being particularly well governed, like Turkey, are looking at the US and wondering what in the world is going on in the United States. And when I break up the murder rate per capita in the United States compared to other rich countries, what you can see is that almost all of the excess murder rate in the United States is given by the yellow part of these bars here, which is murders with guns. All right, so the thing that is exceptional in the United States is the problem of gun violence. This is the thing that the public cares the most about. There was a sign here that was saying the laptop battery is dead. We'll just keep going. That's so what I want to argue is that the reason that we haven't made more progress on this problem is that we've framed the problem incorrectly. All right, and so I can do it without slides too, that's totally fine. We frame the problem incorrectly. So how have we been framing the problem of gun violence historically? A lot of the public attention is devoted to gun control, almost exclusively to the problem of gun control. We have 400 million guns in a country of 330 million people. Some people think that's great, some people think that's not great. Whatever your personal politics on this issue, just pragmatically, that's not going to change anytime soon. So what else can we do to think about the problem? The work that we've been doing in Chicago, the way that I've started to think about this is gun violence is guns plus violence. If we can't do anything about gun availability, for better or for worse, there is still something that we can do in thinking about changing the willingness of people to use guns to harm one another, okay? And what are the, great, thanks so much. What are the conventional, seamless, what are the conventional wisdoms that we have in the United States about the problem of violence, the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another? So if you look at the survey data, most Americans fall into one of two camps, okay? One large segment of the population is of the view that gun violence is due to morally bad people who are not afraid of the criminal justice system. So the only thing that you can do to reduce the willingness of people to use guns to hurt other people is to disincentivize that through threatening people with ever bigger criminal justice sticks. The people who don't agree with that perspective, the survey data show most of the rest of the country is of the view that gun violence is due to economic desperation. Economically desperate people who will do whatever it takes to feed themselves and their families. So the only thing that you can do to address the gun violence problem is steer people away from crime, disincentivize crime by making the alternatives to crime more lucrative, better jobs, more lucrative social programs, okay? And this has basically been, these two quotes that I give you are from the Democrat and the Republican presidential candidates from the 1930s. This is basically the argument that we've been having for 100 years. Has not led to much progress. The murder rate today is almost exactly the same as it was in the 1900s. And what I want to argue is the sort of the key pivot for me in my own sort of thinking about this. We're talking to a lot of practitioners in Chicago, seeing the problem up close, was to recognize that as much hyperpolarization as that we have in the United States right now, the conventional wisdom of the left and the right do share an implicit assumption in their thinking about the problem, which is that both sides agree that before anyone pulls a trigger, the person is deliberately, premeditatedly weighing pros and cons. That's what it means to think that the solution must be bigger carrots or bigger sticks. Incentives has been the thing that we've been arguing about for the last 100 years, okay? And I want to argue that is really where our thinking about this problem has gone sideways. Because our mental image of the gun violence problem, we think it's all due to gang wars over drug selling turf or robberies or something like that. That's not what most of the gun violence problem in America actually is once you start looking at it very closely. It turns out that the overwhelming majority of shootings in America are driven by arguments. So this is data from Chicago, instrumental classifying murders by their motive. Instrumental murders are those in which the violence is in furtherance of some other end. I want your drug corner, I want your wallet or your phone during a robbery. That's only about 1 in 5 murders in Chicago. That winds up being very similar to what you see in the US as a whole. The overwhelming majority of murders in Chicago, in America overall, are arguments that go sideways and end in a tragedy because someone's got a gun. And if you've ever had a road rage moment yourself, you realize that is not you at your most deterrable self. That is not you at your most deliberate thinking through the pros and cons of your behavior self, okay? And I think what that insight made me realize is behavioral economics then gives us a way to understand what people are doing in those moments. And understanding what people are doing in those heated moments starts to give us a chance to think about what we could do to make progress on the problem. So one of the key lessons from behavioral economics over the last several decades is that our minds engage in 2 types of thinking, of which we are aware of only one. The little voice in our head that gives us the capacity to at least sometimes be rational and weigh pros and cons is just one of the 2 types of thinking that our minds do. It's slow thinking, psychologists call it system 2 thinking. That's very powerful, but super mentally exhausting. And so all of our minds have developed a different type of cognition that happens below the level of consciousness that automatically responds to routine situations that we see over and over again in daily life, but sometimes get us in trouble when we overgeneralize that. We mismind read what somebody else is doing. We misconstrue what situation we're in, and those misunderstandings lead us to instigate an altercation or escalate it in a way that winds up leading to tragedy. And so just to very starkly highlight the idea for me was captured by a staff member in the juvenile detention center on the west side of Chicago a few years ago, where he was saying, 20% of the kids in here are psychopaths. You let them out, they're going to hurt other people. They've got to be detained. But the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. I think that is really, it's not just about bad people and bad incentives and bad economic conditions. It's about normal people making regrettable decisions in very difficult circumstances. And I'll just close by pointing out that that way of seeing the problem then leads to a very different type of solution to the problem, right? So we can't rely on people to reason their own way out of the problem by recognizing the intrinsic incentives they face. What we need to do is change the situation by interrupting it and intervening and breaking the spell in some ways. And one way to do that, and there are lots of different ways to do that, right? So if you think about the 10-minute windows, one way to do that is to have some external force step in and break the spell in those 10-minute windows, and that could be a cop, that could be a violence interrupter worker, that could be a neighbor. Sociologists are convinced that collective efficacy, the willingness of neighbors to step in and de-escalate things, is so important. That could be changes to the built environment that we will talk about. And just to make a connection, this is what Jane Jacobs was talking about 60 years ago. She hypothesized that eyes on the street were one of the most important determinants of why similarly poor neighborhoods could vary so much in their crime rates. And the other thing that we will talk more about momentarily is we've been learning in our work in Chicago that it is also possible to teach people, especially young people, to self-interrupt, to recognize when they are in these 10-minute windows and how to navigate them in these difficult circumstances more effectively. And the really exciting part about that, as like a pathologically pragmatic policy person myself, is that we could train detention guards and the detention staff to do that. The thing that's exciting, and effectively. And the thing that's exciting about that is, like, you have the detention staff, you have the kids, you have the building. If you can train detention staff to help kids navigate these 10-minute windows, that's basically a free way to address the violence problem in a world in which almost everybody who goes on to be involved in gun violence passes through our criminal justice system at some point, right? So you can start to see how you can do something at large scale at very low cost. And so just to conclude, one way to sort of think about this is, for 100 years, we've designed a policy response as if the only part of our brain is the deliberate, slow thinking part. And the argument of the book essentially is that the gun violence problem is much more a system one automatic problem than we have appreciated. And that's exciting because we've been fighting for 100 years about the wrong stuff. We've been fighting about stuff that the data suggests is not as effective as we would hope. It's expensive. It leads to huge partisan fights. And I think this new behavioral economics perspective opens the door to a bunch of stuff that sidesteps a bunch of these partisan fights, is pragmatic, the data suggests it works, and it's very low cost. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Jens, for this wonderful presentation. It was incredibly illuminating. I would like, so my name is Hanna Love. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where my research really focuses on the intersection between public safety and place, and really how you can invest in community-based solutions to solve this intractable challenge of gun violence. One thing that I really appreciate about Jens's book is that it makes the point that gun violence has far-reaching implications beyond just the victims of violence or their families themselves. There's cascading ramifications for entire cities. Gun violence can cause people to move out of cities, to disinvest from certain neighborhoods. But there is also a strong role for city leaders to play in reducing gun violence. So that's what we're going to focus on today, and we're going to hear from people who have been working directly on the ground in Chicago and in Philadelphia on solving gun violence. So first, I'll just briefly introduce our two new panelists. So Mayor Karen Freeman-Wilson is the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, where she advances economic, educational, and social progress for African Americans through direct service and advocacy. She was the mayor of her hometown in Gary, Indiana, and was the first Black female mayor in the state of Indiana. She also previously served as the Indiana Attorney General. Prema, to her left, is the president and CEO of the Center City District in Philadelphia, which is dedicated to enhancing quality of life, prosperity, and vitality for downtown Philadelphia. She previously was the vice president of parks in the public realm and has led several different roles in real estate development and civic space management within the city of Philadelphia. So to kick us off, I would love to start with Mayor Karen. I'd love to learn a little bit more about what inspired you to really prioritize the role of reducing gun violence as you were a public official in Indiana, and sort of how you sort of see that role as connecting to you personally.
So first and foremost, grateful to be here. Really appreciated Jan's book, but also the reframing of this issue. I came to this issue because I was running for mayor the third time after having lost the first two elections, reluctantly, but I was driven by driving up to my house with my daughter after a teen party and seeing crime tape around the backyard of my home. Someone had pulled into a neighbor's house 2 doors down and killed someone. And so while I had resolved not to run again, I was like, they don't want me, I don't want them. That experience got me to really think that maybe there was something, having been a prosecutor, a public defender, and seen a judge, and seen this from every angle, that I might be able to do. And the interesting thing, as I think about that time and how I grew to think about it during my 8 years as mayor, was that I was kind of going in thinking about the carrot and the stick. We need to use them together, because I had come out of the drug court movement, where that was very much, and is very much a part of that. But I began to think about the impact of blight as well, and really think about it on in terms of the impact of blight on the thinking of the young people who were engaged in violence and how that must make them feel. And ultimately went to some of the behavioral therapy about changing behavior that we see in use with the call-ins, which is really a product of the violence interruption movement, where you get folks in and say, we want to help you change your behavior.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Prema, you've worked a lot on sort of, advancing real estate development, investing in public spaces, and really activating some underutilized or blighted buildings, like the mayor mentioned. Mm-hmm. I'm curious from your perspective, Philadelphia is often portrayed in the media sometimes as a quite violent city, even though, crime is declining in Philadelphia. And in the Center City District where you work, there's incredibly low rates of crime, right? But yet you still face difficulties of sort of perceptions and realities of crime downtown. Can you explain sort of how you see that in your role and what makes a downtown organization want to prioritize safety?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that we are, as a city, on pace to have the fewest homicides since 1966, which is something we're really proud of, and it's been like a dedicated partnership throughout the city. Look, one of the things that I've learned in this role, and we can talk about it later, but Center City District is very much an operationalizing of eyes on the street. We have a team focused on public safety. We're a partnership of property owners downtown that see public safety as the absolute foundation to any economic development or any economic vitality. And so accordingly, we have about 50 or so uniformed but unarmed community service representatives who have dedicated footbeats, know the names of, people who own businesses, people who live on the street, and really, with a hospitality perspective, connect people to services and connect people to help, and have radios so that they can call the police if necessary, but again, unarmed and more hospitality focused. And I think one of the things that we've learned is exactly what you said, which is, our both downtown, our serious crime is down against 2019, but we're still lagging in terms of perception and how people feel safe. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is like, look, I could talk about crime statistics and numbers and data and show you charts until I'm blue in the face, but that doesn't change the way people feel. And I think operationalizing a set of services around, we have a team of 100 cleaners who clean the sidewalks 3 times a day. We open downtown clean every day. We have these public safety, we have these community service representatives. We also have a public safety bike patrol, also unarmed, a little bit more of a public security perspective. In order to change perception, as you say, you need to show the work and you need to show the people doing the work.
Absolutely. Jens, in your book, you describe 2 different Chicago neighborhoods, right, that are quite similar from an economic perspective and demographically, yet have quite different experiences and rates of gun violence. Can you sort of explain to us, and building off what both Prema and the mayor just said, why are some places more violent than others, and where do you see place fitting into a solution for that?
Yeah, thank you. This was one of the light bulb moments for me to help me realize how little conventional wisdom can explain about this problem. Is I lived for 18 years in Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago, and just south of Hyde Park, there are 2 neighborhoods, Greater Grand Crossing to the west, South Shore to the east, 2 neighborhoods right across the street from one another, Dorchester Avenue. And they have exactly the same poverty rate, exactly the same demographics. They are under exactly the same city, state, and federal gun laws. They are served by exactly the same criminal justice system. So everything that conventional wisdom says drives this problem is literally exactly the same east of Dorchester Avenue and west. And yet the number of shootings per capita is fully twice as high in Greater Grand Crossing than South Shore. So this is just to say the things that were mentioned on the panel and that I mentioned in my opening address, these are not things that have room to explain a little bit of what's going on with gun violence, but a huge amount of this problem is just completely unexplained by the way that we've been thinking about gun violence for 100 years. So there's just a lot here. And I think when you look at the data for South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, this led me to the ideas that I think you both mentioned. One of the things that you can see in South Shore, it has the great luck of being located along what the mayor and I agree is the greatest thing about Chicago, which is Lake Michigan.
For sure.
And because South Shore was located along Lake Michigan as an accident of history, that's where all the stores in the area wind up being. So South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, equally poor, but all of the commercial happens to be in South Shore. And so as Jane Jacobs she predicted 60 years ago was important. Now we have a lot of data to confirm how important it is for public safety. There's just a lot more eyes on the street out and about in South Shore than Greater Grand Crossing. And conversely, I think the other key feature that you can see is there are lots more stressors in place in Greater Grand Crossing than in South Shore. So if you look at 311 calls for people complaining about graffiti, if you look at Google Street Views about the presence of trash and litter and disorder, if you look at where COVID hit harder, so how many people are grieving loved ones through, all of these stressors are much more pronounced in Greater Grand Crossing than South Shore. And the reason that I think that is so important is because it imposes an extra bandwidth tax on everyone who's living in Greater Grand Crossing. And in a world in which your most deliberate, rational, benefit cost calculating self is super mentally exhausting, if you take a whole neighborhood and you turn up the mental bandwidth tax dial there, of course, you're going to see all sorts of downstream negative consequences. And I think the gun violence problem is one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know, just as you said, these kinds of stressors related to either sort of disorder in the public realm or other sort of stressors that put on, challenges to people's mental health are disproportionately connected to patterns of investment, right, within neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods have more of these stressors than others. My question to you, Mayor Karen, is how have you been able to garner support from other neighborhoods that maybe aren't as heavily impacted by gun violence to really change some of these conditions that Jens and you all have talked about?
Well, I think that as we think about Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore and the other 75 neighborhoods in Chicago, because it's a distinct city of 77 neighborhoods, I think that people now understand the importance of investment. That was why we were, along with so many others, so adamant about the placement of the Obama Center in the middle of the South Side, almost central to both South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing. I think also we have to think about the importance of neighborhood organizations like the Chambers of Commerce, because you'll find in South Shore that there is a very active Chamber of Commerce. And even in Greater Grand Crossing, there's a growing organization that focuses on blight, that focuses on economic development, both in the Woodlawn neighborhood, which is adjacent to Greater Grand Crossing. And all of those efforts are important from within the neighborhood because they're organic. But to your point, it's important that people who live outside the neighborhood who have means are willing to invest. And sometimes those investments require incentives. Other times there needs to be some type of attraction, in this case, the Obama Center, that will cause people to invest.
Absolutely. And Prema, you lead one of these such organizations that's invested really in creating opportunity and assets and anchors for people to come and spend time and be safe. Although, as we've mentioned, downtown is already relatively safe. So how do you get the businesses in your district, the stakeholders that you lead, the Chambers of Commerce and others, to start to care about other neighborhoods, perhaps like Kensington or different places in Philadelphia that do have higher rates of gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of this issue we talked about earlier, about this blurring of perception and reality as it relates to gun violence and crime generally, a problem in Kensington or a neighborhood problem becomes a, center city problem, factual or not. And I think it really is important for that reason to think about how we might be able to drive some resources and drive help to it. Because again, in this world of disinformation that we live in, for better or for worse, these problems get conflated. And I think we are now managing to, strange, or I would say new frontiers in media and how our customers all get their information, as well as sort of conflating places.
Absolutely. Thank you for that grounding of the challenge. I do want us to get into solutions. That's one of my favorite things about Jens's book is it's actionable. It's about moving beyond from sort of these either or debates and really trying to understand what we can do now, even in this political environment. So Jens, would you maybe start us off with an overview? You've talked about sort of a 3-tiered set of solutions for addressing gun violence, and I'd like to hear the evidence on that.
Yeah, I mean, one place that I would start is, I think that starting in the 1970s in the United States, like the national policy conversation shifted in the direction of giving up on the idea that we can prevent crime and rehabilitate people who've engaged in it. And I think if all you knew was the social science that we had at the time, I think that was not a crazy perspective. But I think we've learned a lot about human behavior since then. And, I mentioned briefly during my opening remarks about what we've been doing in the detention, and maybe I'll just say a minute more about that. This is by way of analogy, like if you talk to a professional poker player, this will seem very removed from gun violence, but I'll make a connection. If you talk to professional poker players, what they say is one of the most important early things that got them to become much better at poker quickly was they very quickly learn what triggers them to go what they call on tilt. So if you're a poker player, so going on tilt, it's named after a pinball machine. You smack it, you lift it up, it gives you an on tilt error message. Poker players use that term. Poker is all about counting cards and being very rational and whatever. And sometimes you're a poker player and you just get pissed off. And once you let yourself get pissed off, everything sort of unravels and you go home at the end of the night and you're like, oh my God, what happened? And the fact that poker players are saying, oh, I recognized what triggered me. I recognized when that was happening, how to how to like talk myself out of that. The fact that poker players can get better at that, meaningfully better, makes you realize like, oh, this is a skill that people can learn. Now, think about how people learn this in poker the same way that most of us learn lots of things in life through trial and error. And as a poker player, learning through trial and error is not a bad way to learn. But if you're a 16-year-old kid growing up in Englewood or Greater Grand Crossing on the south side of Chicago, when guns, gangs, drugs are common, trial and error is a hugely costly, dangerous way to learn. And so one way to think about the sort of behavioral economics social programs that we've been trying with different nonprofits and government agencies around Chicago is to help kids go through simulated situations where we are architecting them to put the kid on tilt and then kind of like stopping and look at what just happened. Let's reflect on this. It's giving kids basically lots of reps at seeing this in simulated situations where there are no actual downside consequences. And, I mentioned we did this in the juvenile detention center. These are the kids that the juvenile justice system thinks are at highest risk for violence involvement in Cook County. And structured it like a randomized trial, and we reduced recidivism among the kids by 20%. Now, 20% might seem big, it might seem small, but the cost of doing that in juvenile detention was basically free, right? Because it's just, the marginal cost is just a week of training for the guards and nothing else needs to change. Give me 5 things that reduce gun violence by 20% and they're all free, and I think we're really onto something. And I alluded to before, when you look at the data in Chicago, 90% of the shooters and 80% of the shooting victims have arrest records. We had them in the criminal justice system. We had the chance to do something developmentally productive with people, and we blew it. And we need not blow it. So that would be thing number 1 that I would say, is like easy, super low cost, every detention facility in the country should be doing this. The second thing that I would just allude to before is just to build out a little bit more the importance of the built environment and the social environment. I think, when you look at survey data on what the public thinks, which government agencies play a role in public safety, it's like the police, the courts, the prosecutor, the schools, the judges. Like, you go all the way down 40 government agencies, you do not see the city planning department anywhere on there in the surveys that I've seen. And I think that is a huge mistake. I think Jane Jacobs had a very plausible hypothesis 60 years ago that now we have overwhelming data to suggest is true. And I can see in Chicago, like, why can we not? I was talking to a philanthropist who was trying to buy up one of the thousands of, she was trying to, the city is trying to sell these vacant lots for $1 a lot. You go to these lots and they're covered, huge grass, trash, used condoms, needles, empty heroin baggies. Like, these are not places that get neighbors out of their home. They're not in hospitable environments. The city is trying to sell these for $1 each. She was trying to get a bunch of philanthropists to buy these and clean them up. And just the kludge of the city bureaucracy just did not make that possible. You see so many attempts to do sort of commercial development on the south and west sides of Chicago. In Chicago, they run into corruption as well, but also bureaucracy in Chicago. Like, there's a big abundance conversation that we're having right now in the country. I think the second sort of key thing that I would say is, like, let the abundance agenda start on the south and west sides of Chicago and neighborhoods like that where the gun violence problem is most severe.
If I could just pick up on something you were saying, I used to be on the board of an organization called the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, which has this phenomenal pilot program of, I shouldn't say pilot program, a well-established program of cleaning up lots throughout Philadelphia with greening, and the rates they have of reduced crime, just, green, and now they've sort of transitioned from just lawns to pollinator gardens and nice kind of murals and nicer community features, driven by the community. And not only has there been a reduction in crime in those areas adjacent to those lots, there's been a reduction in depression and mental illness. So it's a really wonderful program. And again, in the scheme of things, not particularly expensive.
I just would underscore that one of the first things when we got into office in Gary was to focus on blight elimination. Per capita, we had the highest number of vacant and abandoned buildings. And it was critical to say we've got to get rid of those buildings because they were in many instances breeding grounds for crime. But I also want to speak to, you talked about the juveniles who are, a captive audience, for lack of a better term, but there's also an opportunity in those neighborhoods to address prevention. We know from our State of Black Chicago publication that in 27 of the 77 neighborhoods, there are challenges like this that we talked about. Why not? And I would argue there is a case for mentoring, for helping with those problem-solving techniques that you talked about. And we actually do that in our Youth and Family Services Department to say, these are the things you should think about when you're faced with those decisions before you're faced with them. Because if you teach those problem-solving techniques as a prevention tool, then they don't have to get to the juvenile justice facility.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing on top of this, the other thing, I could hardly agree more, Mayor. The other place where I think, I spent a lot of time talking to people who are in government in cities around the country who are wrestling with two problems. Gun violence, usually the number one problem in Chicago by a lot that the public is worried about, and the fact that the cities are broke, especially now as federal pandemic relief is going away. The city of Chicago is wrestling with a $1.2 billion budget deficit for next year. Nobody knows how we're going to solve it. We cannot throw money at this problem. Yeah. So I'm really trying to think very, very hard about what can you do that takes no money but could meaningfully move the needle. Sure. And the detention center, the more general version of the detention center is where are there institutions that work with lots of young people that have low value added time, that we could repurpose it with very low opportunity cost. And I reflect back to my own experience at Lenape High School in Medford, New Jersey, where the state of New Jersey in its wisdom made me take 4 years of health class, where I learned things like, I should eat more broccoli, I should get 8 hours of sleep, I should definitely not drink alcohol, and here's where babies come from. Super helpful. And yet when you look at the leading causes of death to American adolescents, it's homicide, especially in low-income minority communities. It's suicide, it's drug overdose, and it's car crashes, right? Those are essentially deaths of decision-making. And these sorts of programs that I'm describing, giving kids more reps to not go on tilt, like they typically take something like 15 to 20 hours of working with kids. That is basically like, give us 3 or 4 weeks of the 4 years of health curriculum in high school, and we can really start to move the needle and I think start saving a bunch of lives at super large scale, even before kids make it into the detention center.
Absolutely. So one last question before we hand it over to the audience to ask your questions. We've seen a lot of significant reductions in gun violence in cities across the country since 2023. So cities like Philadelphia, Detroit are seeing their lowest murder rates that they have in generations. What do you think are the common ingredients that these places share, if you can point to any, and what gives you hope that more cities can see this kind of reduction? Anyone can take it first.
So I would say that while they may not have read John's book yet, they recognize that it is a combination of matters. I also think that to Prema's earlier point, that everyone in communities are really getting involved. When you think about Baltimore, when you think about Chicago, when you think about Washington, D.C., and even places like Gary, there are groups of folks who are engaged in violence interruption, that are engaged in addressing blight, that are engaged in helping young people through mentoring and other pro-social behavior, providing opportunities at jobs. People understand that it's all of the above and not just one. I think where the opportunity is really now to think about how to impact that decision making, though, and to really invest in mental health support in that way.
No, please go ahead.
I mean, I wrote down a phrase, Jens, that you use called a mental bandwidth tax, which I'm going to steal and I think probably use every day. But I mean, what are, as sort of actors in this space, playing very different roles, what can we do to lower the mental bandwidth tax of individuals? Is it planting trees? Is it after-school programs? Is it healthcare? Sure. I think one of the reasons Philadelphia has been successful is there's an organization called the Civic Coalition to Save Lives, and they've been very focused on gun violence, and it's been really trying to identify individuals who are at risk and really connecting them with the services they need, or with resources, and I think with comfort, to sort of lower the taxes on their lives and hopefully produce better outcomes. And I think they've been quite successful.
The other thing I'd add, and the point was made in the book, it's not like the folks who are engaged in the gun violence are different from us. Right. You give the very active example of the experience with your dog, with the little dog and the big dog. And I can't imagine those words coming out of your mouth, by the way. But
I had the exact same reaction, no way.
The point is that we all have a mental bandwidth tax.
Sure do.
But we've all dealt better in being able to address those stressors when they come, and we don't have guns readily available.
Yeah. Maybe the only other thing that I would add before we open it up to the audience is the thing that makes me a little bit nervous about the current moment is it starts to, like, all of the glowing coverage about the huge drops in violence that we're seeing around the country gives me a little bit of PTSD of President Bush standing on the aircraft carrier in front of the banner that says mission accomplished. In a world in which the federal pandemic, what has been going on in these cities for the last few years has all been propped up by a lot of federal pandemic relief funds, fantastically so. That going away is not baked into the crime statistics that we're seeing. And I think the thing that makes me deeply nervous for the cities is in a world in which urban downtowns have not figured out yet this post-COVID, like, work from home world. So the economic fundamentals of cities are changing at the same time that federal pandemic relief money is going away. I worry about whether what we're seeing is the start of a very encouraging long-term downward trend, or if what we're seeing is a temporary blip that is going to reverse once the economic challenges of these cities catch up to us. And we'll have to see, and obviously everybody's hoping for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, hopefully at the state and local level, our local leaders can build up some of those programs that did have federal funding, right? It doesn't take just, American Rescue Plan dollars to invest in these kinds of solutions. So that is also one.
And yet the cities and states are all themselves struggling with huge budget problems, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I think it's time for us to move to audience questions. We have Krista in the back who will hand out the microphone. And I would just like to encourage folks to please ask a question rather than a comment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tanya Golash-Bose. I work at the University of California, Washington Center. Thank you for a thought-provoking panel. You mentioned that these intervention programs had the capacity to reduce violence about 20%, which is fantastic. Obviously, any life saved is fantastic. But then you also mentioned that the two neighborhoods, one was twice as violent as the other. And then if you look at the United States compared to Europe, it's like 7 times more violent. So it is obviously not a panacea. So in that context, it just has me thinking about this challenge of, like, what do you say to the argument that you're kind of saying, like, okay, let's just give people these tools, and it's okay that they live in these conditions that are completely unacceptable and completely unlivable, as long as they have the tools to reduce their mental bandwidth. So how do you respond to that sort of, like, let's just get around, the very real problem of inequality in urban?
Yeah, so maybe let me just say sort of two things, which is I think the way that we're going to get out of this problem. So if you look at what happened in Los Angeles and New York from 1991 to today, their murder rates dropped by 80% and 90% respectively. And I think that happened not because they did one thing, but they stacked up a bunch of different things. And I think if you look at what the data says about the effects of all of this sort of portfolio of whatever, I think you can start to, if done sort of thoughtfully, you can accumulate to something big. But now to your main question is, there is a lot of attention, understandably and appropriately, to the question of, like, the causal arrow from poverty and root causes to gun violence. And I think the way that I would answer your question is to say we have underattended to the causal arrow going in the other direction, right, from gun violence to poverty. And this is something that you alluded to, Hannah, in your opening remarks. I'll just elaborate a little bit. So my University of Chicago colleague, Steve Levitt, wrote a paper with Julie Bailey Cullen at the University of California many years ago that showed that every murder that happens in a city on net reduces the city's population by 70 people. 70 people.
Wow.
Fewer people moving in, more people moving out. Now, the city of Chicago has lost 1 million people since 1950. We were a city of 3.7 million, now we're closer to 2.7 million. I spent 18 years living on the South Side. I spent a lot of time going all over the South Side. We don't have as many abandoned buildings as Gary, but there are neighborhoods that are close, right? And, like, one of the key, it's not the only reason the city has lost 1 million people, but we've done the math of the Levitt estimate, and you multiply this out, and gun violence is a major reason why we are depopulating. And so you ask, why is the Chicago Public Schools struggling to educate kids in a school system that's lost 100,000 kids and has under-enrolled? Why did the city give something like a $15 million tax credit to Whole Foods to open in Englewood, one of the most violent neighborhoods on the South Side, only to have that closed. So $15 million flushed down the toilet from not solving the precondition of public safety in the community before, like, so this is to say, getting the gun violence problem under control. Without controlling gun violence, you have a huge headwind for any sort of economic development that you want to do. Yes. You cannot have a Whole Foods in a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago without lots of other people, this is your point, Mayor, without other people willing to come in from other communities. And people were not willing to do that in Englewood. You had to solve the public safety problem first as a tailwind to be able to do that. You need customers living in this neighborhood. You need people living in Englewood to support commercial. You need people willing to come into that neighborhood. So I think solving that can get us out of these sort of vicious cycles where it's like gun violence drives out people, leads to more gun violence. We want to be able to reverse that flywheel and turn the vicious cycles into virtuous cycles.
And I think it really speaks to the significant challenges that city leaders have. You don't have the luxury of saying, okay, I'm going to work on this, and then I'm going to work on that. You have to work on all of that at the same time, which is why organizations like the one in Philadelphia and similar organizations all over the country are so important, because it can't be seen as the purview of government alone.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm Rob Mayer, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for a nonprofit called Kaboom that builds playgrounds in historically disinvested neighborhoods. I'm also the former Director of Policy for the City of Buffalo, New York. One of the challenges I struggled with, and you alluded to, was how do we get people to change their perspective on place? I think there's a strong reliance on economic development coming in as the spark for revitalizing neighborhoods, when in actuality, it's that civic infrastructure that I think brings people into neighborhoods and makes them vibrant places 24/7, and then the economic development follows. But city leaders and civic leaders are trapped in this mindset of economic development first. So how do we present the research and the intuitions you have to get them to change their mind?
Yeah, the light bulb moment that I had for this, if I were smart, I would have had a slide for this so you can see the picture, but it's in the book, and let me describe it to you. And like the graph that we produced at the crime lab where the light bulb went off in my head, and I was like, oh, I totally see everything clearly once you see this. It's like neighborhood income level. Imagine a graph where you have neighborhood income level on the x-axis. It's Brookings, so I can talk through a graph, right? On the y-axis, it's shooting rates per capita, okay? And what you see in that graph is every rich neighborhood in Chicago has low rates of gun violence. Not as low as in Japan or the UK or whatever, but for Chicago, relatively speaking, a low level of gun violence. And every neighborhood that has an astonishingly high rate of gun violence is poor. That's what you see on the news and for yourself, right? It's like, I'm driving around the north side of Chicago. I'm like, it's so nice here. I'm looking at the news, or I'm living on the south side, right? It's like, oh, here's where the gun violence is concentrated. All those neighborhoods are low income. But it is not true that every low income neighborhood has the same rates of gun violence. And the South Shore Greater Grand Crossing example is not cherry picked, right? If you look at a map of, if you look at this graph in the book, at the same neighborhood income level, that neighborhood income level can give you a gun violence rate of X or a gun violence rate of literally 20X, right? And once you see that graph, you see the variation across similarly poor neighborhoods, you immediately see, oh, I get it. It is not like, yes, poverty is part of this, but there is a ton of this once you see that graph that is not. I'm happy to email you the slide of the graph. Like, I think that would be the picture. If other people are like, if other people's brains work like mine, I'd be like, oh, that is the picture that like unlocks the intuition for why you need to be expanding your thinking about root causes beyond neighborhood poverty to this other stuff as well.
I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. So, yeah.
Thank you for this. This is fantastic. I really appreciate this panel. My name is Andrew Thompson. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Penn. Go Birds.
Go Birds.
I'm from
I see
Philadelphia,
you wearing
so
your green. Thank you.
I'll also give you a Go Birds. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. So I have a question. Apologies for being really academic-y. But with regard to thinking about outcome here, as it translates to or doesn't in thinking about policy, what I'm wondering what y'all have to say about this is thinking about the ways in which intervention can affect homicide rates and just general violence in the way of shootings versus that of the public perceptions of it, and whether or not you see those things as in alignment or altogether different problems. The alternative that I'm thinking of here is really like intervention that leads to the potential reduction and then almost an expected lag in the way of how the public then perceives it, or if it's altogether something different. Thanks.
You want me to
For you, yeah.
Like, I think there's you guys might totally disagree with what I'm about to say, which is totally fine, but I'll give you the way that I've come to think about this is like, there are all these surveys that people do that, ask the public, oh, do you think crime is going up or down? And that correlates very poorly with whether crime is actually going up or down. Mm-hmm. And that's led, people's perceptions are totally unrelated to whatever. And here's my interpretation of that, right? Which is like, for work, I spent August in Australia and Japan, where the murder rate is 1 per 100,000 in Australia, 0.2 per 100,000 in Japan. I was talking to a bunch of government officials, and I mentioned that the Chicago murder rate was 22 per 100,000, and a woman in the audience literally gasped out. Like, she was like, oh, couldn't believe it. And so one hypothesis that I have about these surveys is like, people are answering these surveys with a lot of system 1, not just system 2. Mm-hmm. And when they're saying, I think crime is going up, I hypothesize that partly what they're saying is there is way too much crime. Yes, the murder rate went down by 30% over the last however many years in Chicago, but we have a murder rate that is 110 times what they have in Japan, and that's unacceptable. In contrast, when you look at the Steve Levitt data, he's looking at he's looking at people's actual behaviors, right? When actual crime rates go up or down, that is the thing that is changing people's willingness to move into Chicago or stay in Chicago. And so I hypothesize that people's behavior is much more responsive to actual crime than those surveys. This is a hypothesis, maybe I'm wrong, but that's my sort of hypothesis for reconciling these two different sort of strands of research that point in different directions.
I would just say, like, at risk of opening up our consumer-based study to the economics department at the University of Chicago, the way we phrase the question is, how often do you feel safe while in Center City? Mm-hmm. And we do an annual survey, and it's about 5,000 people that respond annually, and it's personal. How often do you feel safe? So crime may be up, you might feel safe because you're it's sort of that way. And we do still see that, like, looking at those lines next to each other, violent crime in Center City compared to personal perception of safety, there is still a huge wide post-pandemic. Mm-hmm. So it's a little different. And again, I'm fearful of giving you our exact wording because it's not scientific, but I think it's good enough for our purposes.
I think we also have to acknowledge the impact of the media. Mm-hmm. on people's perceptions. If you see enough significant, violent crime portrayed, it's going to have, even though it may be isolated, mm-hmm. or it may not even happen as much, or the statistics may be down, because you've seen it portrayed, mm-hmm. It makes you feel less safe.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think just one thing to add to that is that place also matters where someone lives in their perceptions. So even when people increasingly perceive crime to be a growing challenge, they often feel that their own neighborhood is more safe than other places throughout the city. And I think that really points to a lot of the strength that we've all talked about today in people and community and civic infrastructure, in addition to economic prosperity for creating safety.
For sure.
I believe we may actually be at time, so I apologize that we do not have time for one more question, but we can stick around for a bit. And thank you all so much for coming. We also have some copies of Jens's book outside if anyone wants to read it. Highly recommend. So thank you all, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.